Hello and welcome to another edition of Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello Shaka.
Hello Paul.
How are you?
Hugely terrific.
Well, we have another great week ahead of us, but we'll start with exciting news from Africa. But before we start, let's talk about, let me maybe take this opportunity to welcome you all, our Facebook followers watching us live from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka himself. Shaka, let's go to Angola. For the first time, maybe in a long time, we haven't talked about Angola. But there's something interesting, something happening in Angola. The new kid on the block, the president of Angola, is beginning to crack his whip, taking out literally all those guys who are part of the old regime. Your thoughts?
It's a very, very high time, and to be honest with you, it is interesting that President Lourenco is making things happen. He's moved away from these other leaders who basically talk the talk without walking the talk. This man right now, as we talk, he's hardly in power for 1 year, remember? He came into office, I think, if I remember correctly, back in September of last year. He's not yet a year in office, but you can imagine how much he has accomplished in terms of fighting corruption.
But is it sustainable? A lot of critics would argue that he's been part of the system that actually brought him into power. If you're looking for anybody who is corrupt, he's arguably one of those people.
To be very honest with you, I have not seen anything that connects him with that type of behavior. That is not to say that he may not be part of it. Obviously, he was part of the system. But I think the fact that he is able to do what he's doing right now, he must be having what they call moral authority. And in fact, it is something that had to be done, in fact, yesterday, because let's face it, Angola is incredibly rich, but very, very few people are rich. And those, in fact, were connected to the past president, or the former president, President José Eduardo dos Santos. He was a very rich man. He was in power for 38 years, mind you. He succeeded a man called Dr. Agostinho Neto, a man who died back in 1979. His son, very rich man, he used to be controlling a multi-billion-dollar foundation. And you know that he has actually been indicted also for having siphoned away more than actually $500 million US to banks in the United Kingdom. Then you have his daughter, who has the distinction of being the richest female in Africa. And yet, the question is, how did she, in fact, earn that money? She used to be, by the way, the boss of Sonangol, the state oil industry. That's where most of the money in Angola come from, until, of course, she was fired by the incumbent president. This man knows what he's doing. And the fact that he is even able to fire the army chief of staff, who apparently was trying to figure out a way of getting a credit line of $50 billion US. Can you imagine? He also fired the chief of foreign intelligence. This man must know what he's doing. Let's face it. Until he became president, he was Minister of Defense. He's also a general in his own right. He is a former freedom fighter, or at least a liberation fighter. You know, when the MPLA, seized the power back in 1975. This is a man who also, just like his predecessor, studied in what was then the Soviet Union. And he got himself a degree in what they call historical sciences to boot in the Soviet Union. He is formidable. He seems to be on the right track.
How about those critics who say that maybe perhaps he's doing this, there's everything he's trying to hide, and most of the targets are politically motivated?
Forget about that, because let's face it, I am not one of those people who is going to come and say, I know for sure that the Angolan judiciary is an independent arm of government, and that it is obviously incorruptible. I don't know that. But let's face it, this information is coming out of the Angolan judiciary. These are the courts which are actually trying to do their job. And let's face it, what is the reaction so far? People, in fact, are urging him to go on. So I think this man knows exactly what he's doing. He also knows that it is the right thing to do because, as I said, Angola is one of the richest countries in terms of resources. But in terms of distribution, you will find hundreds of thousands of people, my brother, sleeping on the streets of Rwanda, the capital, and what have you. Come on, man. Angola, the Rwandan capital, for example, Rwanda, happens to be one of the most expensive neighborhoods to live in. And yet people don't have the money. It's only very few people who have money.
Let's move along. Let's cross over to Malawi. Former President Joyce Banda, there are reports that she's going back to her country nearly 4 years after she's been in self-imposed exile. Your thoughts?
Well, I think it is high time she went back, really. You know, of course, that it was alleged that she was involved in the Cashgate, a very obviously unfortunate, kind of, event that took place in Malawi when she was in office. But in fact, the facts will show that she inherited this Cashgate from the president that she succeeded, who actually died, Dr. Bingu wa Mutharika. And yes, there were some very high officials in her cabinet. They were, in fact, some of them found guilty, and they are serving time for that. And recently, I saw that the Malawian courts found that there was no evidence. There was no evidence to nail Joyce Banda. So I think she's very free to go back to her country. And perhaps since there is going to be an election very soon, present herself and see if she can have a shot at State House again. Who knows?
Shaka, I was in Malawi right after the elections took place nearly almost 5 years ago. And Joyce Banda at the time had just lost those elections. And to be honest with you, I spoke to a lot of people on the ground, young people, old people, and nobody seemed to like her for some reason. They didn't think that she measured up to the level of leading that country, that she was not a strong leader.
Are you suggesting that you sort of carried out something equivalent perhaps to a public opinion survey?
Not necessarily, but from just observing and talking to people. And I'm not talking about politicians. I went to the markets, I went to universities, talked to young people, and that's the impression I got.
Well, when you are in power, there are always going to be those people that support you. Some of them, in fact, sycophants, because obviously they have something to benefit from you. And there are also going to be other people that are not going to be, to particularly like you. Let's face it, she also happens to be a female. How many female have you known who have actually occupied that position in Africa? In addition to Joyce Banda, we have only seen one, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia. And you come from Africa, where I also happen to come from. The stereotype about women leaders and all that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, that some people may not even have the evidence. They may not even care about whether, in fact, she did a terrific job and what have you. But the fact that she was a woman, they probably feel that she was, in fact, doing some kind of interfering, becoming the owner or in charge of State House, rather than perhaps being where a lot of other people, unfortunately, they say, a woman belongs to the kitchen.
Interesting. You've had an opportunity to interview her.
Yes.
On a number of occasions. What does she bring to the table?
Remarkably articulate. I'm sure that you were around when, were you around when I actually had the Horn Straight Talk Africa?
Yes.
Oh, come on, man. I mean, let's face it. This is someone that knows what she's doing. She may not be the best, if you compare her with some other people and what have you, but let's face it. She was able to articulate whatever kind of vision that she had. Only that, of course, let's face it, she was in power for about 2 years. So she didn't even have a one full term in order for her, frankly, to put some of the ideas that she had into practice. And so I think she deserves really the benefit of the doubt.
Let's move across to Southern Africa. There's some exciting news about former President Jacob Zuma. The buzz is that he's just found himself a new wife, a 24-year-old. What a remarkable gentleman.
And
I think
is,
he has
wife number 5?
I cannot count. I stopped counting some time back.
But you know, that is a very interesting neighborhood because let's face it, you know the king of Swaziland, who apparently has since changed the name, he probably has, you know, you're talking about double digits. Now, in fairness to Jacob Zuma, you have to, first of all, accept the fact that he's entitled to his constitutional and democratic rights. Because let's face it, the last time I checked, when you look at the very progressive constitution, by the way, of South Africa, probably the best on the continent and probably one of the best in the world, to be honest with you. Both the constitution of the Republic of South Africa and the culture of the Zulu people, where Mr. Zuma Mushorozi hails from, allow for you to have as many spouses as you can afford. So he's not really committing any crime here. Yes, he's a 76-year-old man. Yes, this young lady is a 24-year-old lady.
Old enough to be his granddaughter.
Yes, but let's face it, these two individuals are adults, and these two individuals are essentially asserting their constitutional rights. I am told that this lady began seeing Mr. Zuma when she was 19. And so, frankly, we are not talking about something here under the age and all that kind of stuff. There are no crimes
If it was
here,
that would be defilement, right?
I don't think it would be defilement because if you are 18 in this country, you are an adult.
But
you
looking at the age of...
yeah, but you are allowed. You can get married. You can get married. And let's face it, South Africa has even also other aspects that are probably different from a lot of African countries. In South Africa, for example, they have what you would call proportional representation. In South Africa, unlike most countries, you do not vote specifically for an individual for member of parliament. You actually vote for a political party. And each party, if it gets 5%, I think, if I remember correctly, then it is entitled to representation in parliament. And the party has the right to choose the specific individual that serves into that office. In South Africa, you do not have a presidential system where somebody goes throughout the country campaigning to be the next president. It is the party or the coalition of parties, if they win to go into parliament, they are the ones, in fact, that eventually elect or choose somebody to be president. So there are differences here. And I think, really, there are a lot of things that a lot of African countries, sincerely, need to kind of like borrow from South Africa, because let's face it, we've talked about how South Africa is one of the few countries on the continent that is able, for example, to recall a president, or anybody for that matter. And we have agreed that, let's face it, at least for now, it has demonstrated that it is the beacon of hope for African democracy so far.
You are watching Shaka Extra Time, and Shaka, let's go back to maybe something very controversial that is also happening on the continent, the River Nile. A lot of, this is a river that arguably starts in Uganda and goes all the way to Egypt, but there is a lot of controversy surrounding who owns the water that actually, some people call it the lifeblood of most of these countries. So let's talk about that.
It's a good poll that you say arguably originates from Uganda. And here you are talking, in fact, about the White Nile. You're not talking about the Blue Nile. The Blue Nile originates from Ethiopia. But even the White Nile...
River Nile, White Nile, then Blue Nile.
Well, White Nile, Blue Nile, they both form what is called the Nile River. But the thing is, the question even about the source. Speck, allegedly discovered the source of the Nile in Jinja, where you and I actually had some, called home for some time. And yet, let's face it, first of all, there's no way Speck could have discovered the source of the Nile because he was not the first individual.
There were local people.
Precisely. The other thing is that when you go to Bujumbura, you go to Rwanda, in fact, they have a hotel called Source de Nile, the source of the Nile. They actually claim to be the authentic or the original source of the White Nile. When you go to Rwanda, you have the same thing. The Congolese, all that kind of stuff. So really, we don't actually know the authentic origin of the White Nile. But having said that, it is very, very interesting that there have been about 4 agreements about how the now 10 countries could actually figure out a way of sharing that resource. But the most important agreement is the one, guess what, which was signed in 1929 between Egypt and what was then called Great Britain. And Great Britain was signing that agreement on behalf of some of the colonies and protectorates and the territories that were under her, colonial leadership. So we're talking about Kenya. We're talking about then, Kenya was a settler colony. It was in fact never supposed to be really independent under Africans. It was a settler colony. And then you have south of Kenya, there was a country called Tanganyika. It was a territory. Now Tanzania, having Tanganyika and Zanzibar coming together in 1964, you have Tanzania. Then you had Uganda. These were the countries that had actually been, were part of the agreement of 1929. But guess what? This agreement provides a veto power to Egypt, even though it does not, in fact, these waters do not originate from there, but it has veto powers.
And it has even threatened to go to war.
In fact, it has threatened to go to war with Ethiopia because Ethiopia is doing something that the Egyptians do not think was actually in their interest, because they are building some kind of huge Renaissance dam, which would be providing electricity and what have you in that region. And let's face it, by the way, the Blue Nile actually has more waters that pour into the Nile than the White Nile, because the White and the Blue Nile actually meet in the Sudan before they move on to Egypt and the Mediterranean. So it is a very unfair agreement, just like back in 1884, the Berlin Conference under Chancellor Bismarck, which brought about what history regards to as the scramble for Africa, where European powers actually sat around a huge table with not a single African present. But guess what? The Africans are actually trying to fit into those boundaries.
Yeah, that's a good segue. Let's go to our Facebook comments, Shaka. There is a Facebook from Nigeria here who says, Emily Okoli says, as a Nigerian living in Nigeria, those saying that Mr. Buhari is incorruptible is purely a fallacy. Buhari is not only corrupt, but nepotistic and incapable. What's your take, Shaka?
Well, I think that my brother is entitled to his opinion, but from where I am and the kind of research or homework that I have done, to be honest with you, I have gone all over the place. I have not found the kind of evidence that this gentleman is sort of quoting in terms of Buhari being corrupt. I don't know about being nepotistic. He probably has more information about that than I do. But I think most reasonable people so far, when they look at past Nigerian leaders, they will say that this man, who was a major general, who was catapulted into power back first in 1985 by a coup led by General Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida and Sani Abacha. These guys, after 2 years, they had to overthrow Buhari precisely because he was actually fighting or trying to fight against corruption. And these guys happened to be like not only commander-in-chief of their armies, but they were also like commander-in-chief of corruption.
Let's go to another Facebook comment from Ayub Khan. He lives in Cape Town, South Africa. He writes, President Paul Biya of Cameroon and President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda have no more vision for their nations. Your take?
Well, I don't know whether they have or they do not have the vision. All I can say is that, at least from the little I know about both, they cannot claim to be Democrats because the manner in which they actually stay in office, it's not really through elections whose results are reflections of the voters, but rather it is a facade. Their election results are reflections of the people who they personally choose to count the elections and also to announce those elections. So these people are not even accountable to their people. They are probably accountable to the treasury, which they use to bribe people and compromise others. And also, they are accountable maybe to their armies, their security forces, the obvious institutions that bring about violence, intimidation, and what have you, but not the people. I think there is a lot of evidence, a lot of copious evidence in terms of at least that context. But whether or not they have run out of visions or whatever, I don't know, because let's face it, they have been in power for many, many years, each of them more than 3 decades. But frankly, when you look at development and what have you, you don't see them, you don't see their countries mentioned anywhere. And yet, we sometimes talk about a guy from Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who was in power for 31 years, which is much less than each of them, yet he has the results. Singapore was a poor third world country. By the time he left, after 31 years, Singapore is a major superpower. It is probably the largest financial center in the world. It also has one of the largest income per capita in the world. It is in fact in the league of developed nations. But when you go to Uganda or you go to Cameroon, you don't see anything, frankly, just because somebody has been in power for 32 years for Uganda, and I think about 36, 37 for Cameroon.
In fairness to Uganda now President Yoweri Museveni, people can argue a lot of, his fans could argue that he has brought stability. People actually use that to say that they sleep at night. There is economic and social development. You can talk about the roads. There is infrastructure development. You can drive from one point to another. Isn't that fair to say about President Yoweri Museveni?
First of all, if you are in a government, frankly, that's what you are supposed to do. You are supposed to do something. But when you talk about stability and peace, what do you actually mean? Or what do those people mean by stability and peace? Is it simply because somebody has been in the State House uninterrupted for so many years? Stability and peace, Paul, someone would argue that it is not the absence of war. It is not the absence of violence. Rather, it is the presence of socio-economic justice for all. Do those things obtain in those two countries that you have talked about?
I think so. I think so.
What do you mean you think so?
Yeah.
You talk about socio-economic justice?
Yes.
How can you talk about socio-economic justice where you don't even have an election, you have selections? How can you talk about socio-economic justice where there is no service delivery or inadequate service delivery, to the extent that even the president himself at one time demonstrated that he had absolutely no confidence in his own country to the extent that his daughter, who was supposed to give birth and not sick, was dispatched to Germany in a presidential jet just to give birth.
Okay, real quickly, let's go to another Facebook comment from Kayola Mustafa. He wants your take on how you distinguish African leaders from African rulers. Make it very brief.
Very interesting, because the answer is very simple. If you are an African leader, it means that you are accountable to your people. And it also means that it is your people who have chosen you to be in office. So there is that kind of dynamic. On the other hand, an African ruler is somebody who does not account his actions to his people, simply accounts his actions to the security forces that he commands and the treasury that he uses to bribe and compromise people.
What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Well, very interestingly, tomorrow, in fact, there is a special town hall edition, and it is going to be looking at the issue of autism, and it is going actually to be moderated by the one and only Leno Modu, someone that, of course, has a lot of experience, has hosted a lot of health issues, and I think I can't wait to see it myself.
Okay, we still have time for maybe another question. Let's go to another Facebook comment from Cameroon. Let's go to Pius Takim in Cameroon. He says, the United Nations has played a significant role in helping nations that really sometimes seek for help. Why can't the United Nations go to their rescue in Cameroon?
Well, it depends what we are talking about. I'm sure that they have United Nations presence in the Cameroon. I'm sure they have the UNDP. I am sure that they have offices of UNHCR. They have the offices of World Health Organization and what have you. And I'm sure these different offices are making a difference in the Cameroon, one or the other. But if you are talking about bringing about democracy and that kind of stuff, I don't see how democracy can come from the United Nations, because even the Security Council itself, which has 5 permanent members, only 3 countries, Britain, France, and the United States, can probably claim to have democracy, because when you talk about Russia and China, they can't pretend to have democracy. And guess what? They actually hold or wield veto power.
In 30 seconds, is there democracy in Tanzania, considering that the government is now forcing bloggers, vloggers to pay tax on whatever they post online?
I think that everything I have been seeing lately, and the new president, of course, he's been there for quite some time right now, John Pombe Magufuli, I would probably say that Tanzania is democratically challenged as we talk.
Yeah, well, on that note, thank you so much. Once again, Shaka, it's always a pleasure having you here. It was a great conversation. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time.
The feeling is mutual.
Until then, so long from Washington.